Hi. So you've done some reading about what genres are, what they do for us, and how they come into being. And I wanted to give you a short presentation on some more pointers about analyzing a genre, when you come across a new one, how to kind of pick it apart so you can more effectively work with a client in a tutorial. So if you have someone, for example, coming from biology and they bring in a piece of writing that you're unfamiliar with, what are some analytical ways that you can think about that genre in order to help the writer most effectively meet the situation that they're writing for? And I want to start with a couple pointers about genres, and your reading covered this, but this might be a little more of an accessible way to think about it. Genres all came into being for a certain reason. So we created a genre, for example, to meet our needs somehow. They respond to the needs of situations that recur. So if we keep ending up in a situation where we need a type of writing to help us get things done, a genre is born, right, in order to help us perform that action. So they have a purpose for writers. They also all have agreed upon common characteristics or features. Those are more or less restrictive depending on what type of writing we're talking about or what type of genre we're talking about. They also all have rules that writers need to follow, though those rules can be more or less rigid depending on what genre we're talking about. So usually within a given community, we have a agreed set of rules or conventions that we keep in mind when it comes to that particular genre. So for example, if we're talking about a genre like the syllabus, which is a genre that everyone in this course should be pretty familiar with, how we would analyze that genre, if we've never seen it before, would be a couple of these questions. Why did the syllabi start being written? Or why did the syllabus start being written, right? We probably created this genre because we needed a way to more effectively assess what different professors were teaching in their courses and whether or not it fit with the department's curriculum, the university's curriculum, and in our case, the state. It also helps the teacher because it helps me keep in mind what the goals of my course are. It helps organize me. And it also performs an action for the student in the course, right? So it's something that they can consult throughout the semester to remind themselves of the rules of the class, what things are worth, when the major deadlines are, etc. The content that's typically contained in the syllabus is pretty similar, right? So throughout the genre, we expect to see certain things. We expect to see major deadlines for the course. We expect to see grading procedures. We expect to see something like, an attendance policy, an AI policy. It has a lot of boilerplate stuff that has to go into it that we expect to see when we come about a syllabus. And as readers, again, that helps us more efficiently assess whether or not we're interested in taking the course. That all is there for a reason. You can also think about what that genre typically looks like. So what a syllabus usually looks like is they're not particularly exciting looking documents. They're usually black and white. They're usually about, 8 to 10 pages. They have patterns, right, that we can expect as readers. How it's organized, those are typically organized pretty similarly, right? So we usually start with like a description of the course. We get into the course materials. So they tend to follow a similar structure as well. In terms of tone, usually pretty formal, but depending on the professor, it can be more or less informal. What rules professors have to follow in writing syllabi, we have to make sure that they're accessible documents, right? That they have to usually exist in PDF and Word format. They're usually posted in very similar places. In my case, we have to post it to the institution's website as well as our own Blackboard course. So there are rules that we have to follow when writing a syllabus. We can't just do whatever we want. And that's for a reason, to make it easier for our course to be assessed and for us to keep ourselves organized and to help our students determine what the major rules are of our course and whether or not they want to take it. We'll give you another genre. This one's a little bit more fun. The country music song. When we are analyzing that genre, these are, again, similar questions as the one before. What is the purpose of the genre of a country music song? For what reason did country songs start being written? And you could say a lot of different things there, for entertainment, to get somebody's feelings out, lots of reasons, right? In terms of characteristics and features, what content is typically contained in a country song? Usually there are patterns, right? So there are a lot of discussions of, sad things like losing your love. They talk a lot about partying in a field. They talk a lot about, these are all like stereotypes, but it happens. You could probably name a lot more of those. What they typically sound like, they usually kind of twangy. They use similar instruments, right? So there are things that we expect to hear. How they're organized, usually like a typical song, right? So we have like bridges, we have verses, we have a chorus. The tone is pretty informal, right? That's pretty normal for country songs. We probably don't want a country song that's too formal. It would feel a little rigid and weird. Rules that artists need to follow when writing a country song. What are some ways that they are constrained or limited by how the genre is dictating how they write their song, right? If they want to be on the radio, it has to be a certain length. I think it's like 3.5 minutes. Can't be any longer than that, right? They probably can't put a lot of profanity in there, and if they do, it has to be bleeped out on the radio. So there are constraints and rules that they have to keep in mind when they're writing that genre, right? Another question that you can ask about genres is, does anyone get to change or adapt the expected conventions of something like a country song? Lately, there have been kind of hybrid country genres, right? So people who are mixing hip hop with country, people who are mixing rock with country, right? It's interesting to think about in terms of who gets to do that, who doesn't. Usually, people who have been around for a while can play with the genre a little bit more. But that's interesting to think about in terms of power and who gets to change genres. So to return back to some of the vocab I've been using so far, when I say the word conventions, what I mean is these are basic qualities and agreed upon rules that a genre has, right? So these are common characteristics and features that we're used to seeing when we come across that genre. So they can include a lot of things like forms of style, design, other rhetorical practices that are expected and agreed upon in a community, right? So, for example, with the country music song, there are some conventions that we expect to hear, right? There's a certain kind of voice that people use when they're singing country. So that's what conventions are when I say conventions. If we take a look at another genre that we use every day, the email genre, there are a lot of conventions that we have to kind of stay within when we're writing an email, right? So we have to make sure that we have a subject line, and we have to make sure that that subject line is descriptive. We have to make sure we have a salutation in there, that we're not just starting right into the email, otherwise that might be kind of rude. We have a body of an email that we keep as concise as possible. We have a closing statement. We have our name at the bottom. Sometimes we have a signature. This was back when I was a PhD candidate a million years ago. So emails also have conventions as genres that we expect to see, and we expect writers to kind of work within in order to get their communication across. How do we write as effectively as we can when undertaking a communication? This goes back to last week's writing about rhetoric. We have to consider the rhetorical situation of our task and genre consideration, which genre we want to choose in order to communicate to an audience, is part of this. So when we talk about the rhetorical situation, and this is a little bit of a review from last week, rhetoric is all about communication. Rhetoric is using language effectively to persuade someone, inform them, educate, entertain them. And the rhetorical situation is the circumstances in which you communicate. So the rhetorical situation kind of surrounds you as a writer or as a communicator, And usually this is what it looks like. Okay, so this is my depiction of the rhetorical situation. Surrounding you is the context. So this is what community you're within, what setting you're within, where you are in the world, right? That can kind of change how you communicate depending on what your larger context is. Kairos comes into play here too. So when are you making this communication? Are there things you need to keep in mind because of the timeliness of this communication, right? Are there certain events happening right now that you need to make sure that you consider? You have your purpose, which we talked about before. This is often described as your exigence or your reason for writing. We have the writer right here. We have the audience that you're communicating to. We have the topic you're talking about. And in the middle, we have the genre of the text that you're choosing. So what a text type is. And again, each one has its own conventions or rules that the writer must follow or adapt depending on the rhetorical situation. So genre plays a very central role in how we communicate or how we get actions performed as a writer. So to give you an example, a rhetorical situation could be I'm a cook in a dining hall. I need to tell my boss that I need a day off in 2 weeks and it's one of our busiest days. She's never there in person when I work. What's my rhetorical situation? What genre of communication should I use to accomplish this rhetorical task, right? If this were me, I would probably use email because it's the most efficient way to get that information across and it's in writing. Depending on your boss though, they might not like that. They might prefer that you come over to their office in person and ask, right? So you have to think about your rhetorical situation and kind of balance the different components to think about what genre you want to choose for that task. Another example, if you're thinking about the professional email again, you want to think about the overall purpose of the email you're writing, why you're writing it. If you're trying to persuade someone of something or apologize or maybe request something, set up a meeting, let someone go. These purposes are all going to dictate how you think about language, tone, and content of your email, okay? You also want to think about what information is needed for your reader in order to accomplish your purpose. When you're writing within a genre, you also want to think about your audience. So who are you sending this to? Are you sending this to a superior or a colleague? Your language is going to be kind of different depending, right? A total stranger that you're hoping to network with. Think about your emails as being very receiver-centric. That's important to the genre. Does your audience need to hear something specific in order to take you seriously as a professional? How might you consider the design of the email, the organization, the lengthiness, clarity, correctness, things like that? What might they expect from you, given the purpose of your email and your relationship with the person? It's important to use empathy in that situation in an email, okay? You also want to be considering your perspective. So how do you feel about what you're about to write? How might you consider factors like emotion? If you're really angry about something in an email, sometimes it can come across the wrong way. And then what are the goals that you want to get out of that correspondence? Finally, you want to consider the overall context and rhetorical situation and timing of a genre like an email, right? So what kind of business or group are you or this person affiliated with? Is there specific content or maybe a format that this person might be expecting given that business context, okay? What other events are occurring at the time of this email that you're sending? Are you late in sending it? Or are you meeting a deadline? Thinking about the timing is important to that genre in particular. And then you want to think about, finally, how do we work within the constraints of the genre of the email, right? So we're a little bit limited with an email because people can't see us when we're talking, right? So they can't see our body language. Sarcasm may or may not come across the right way. And we want to be thinking about tone, professionalism, making sure we're proofreading. We want to make sure that it's not too long. So it's a genre that's kind of limited in terms of length. We don't want to send somebody a wall of text, right? So these are all examples of how you can pick apart a genre with a client, particularly if it's a new genre for them and for you. You can think about the components of the rhetorical situation, what the genre is, okay, how it came into being, what its purpose is, and whether or not it's a good choice if the 2T is making a choice of what genre to use. These questions can help. So that's a little bit more about genre and the rhetorical situation. I hope this was helpful.